I'm Dana Granger, and I was 32 the day my father parked my grandmother in an airport lounge like a bag he meant to lose. He smiled when he said it. Just sit here. We'll check in and come right back. My grandmother had Alzheimer's. She believed him for about 4 minutes. So did I. My parents thought leaving her in that lounge was the end of it. They had no idea the nurse they raised had already started writing down the time. What I did next is the reason a judge later looked my father in the eye and used the word unfit. This is the story of a one-way ticket nobody thought I'd read. Welcome back to Calm Drama World. Quiet stories about ordinary women, impossible families, and the line you finally decide no one gets to cross again. If that's your kind of story, settle in, pour the coffee, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. I grew up with 2 families inside one. There were my parents in Lincoln, in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn that got mowed in diagonal stripes. And there was my grandmother Edith, on 160 acres outside Kearney, 2 hours west on I-80. My father, Raymond, sold insurance and smelled like cologne and certainty. My mother, Carol, ran the house like a showroom. They loved photographs of the family more than the work of being one. Grandma loved the work. She taught me to weed a lavender row before I could read. She hummed old hymns over the sink and let me stay up past bedtime shelling peas. When I became a geriatric nurse, people said I had a gift for the elderly. I just had Edith. By the time I tell you about, I was between travel contracts, living alone in a small rental on the east side of Lincoln, which is a polite way of saying I was the one with time. In families like mine, the one with time becomes the one with the job. Grandma had been moved off the farm a year earlier into my parents' guest room. So we can help her, Mom said. I should have heard the quotation marks. The strange part started small. My mother, who hated dirt under her nails, suddenly wanted to talk about the farm, land values, acreage, whether the old place was really worth keeping. I chalked it up to stress. Caregiving wears people thin, and I knew that better than anyone. So I told myself she was tired, not scheming. That's the thing about the people you love. You give them the benefit of the doubt long after they've stopped earning it. And I gave mine right up until the gate agent called the flight. The week before the trip, my father asked me a question that didn't belong in his mouth. Do you happen to know where the deed to the farm is kept? We were at their kitchen island. He asked it the way you'd ask about a spare key. I said I didn't and watched him not be disappointed enough. 2 days later, my mother floated a brochure across the same counter. A memory care community, glossy, with a fountain on the cover. It would be so good for her, she said. Professionals around the clock. I'm a nurse. I know good memory care exists. And I know it costs money the brochure never prints. So I did what I'd tell any family to do. I asked to see the paperwork. I asked which facility, what the admission date was, whether they'd toured it. I said I wanted a care conference, all of us at one table, before anything moved. My mother smiled and changed the subject to the trip. That was the new plan, apparently. A family reconciliation trip to Arizona. The 4 of us plus Grandma, to look at a condo they were thinking of buying. It sounded almost sweet. It sounded like the kind of thing functional families do. I had a bad feeling, the low kind that sits under your ribs. But I had no proof and no good reason to refuse a trip framed as healing. So I said yes. And I told myself I'd ask my questions again at the gate. Here's the part one want you to hear, because I've replayed it 1,000 times. I saw the warning. I asked the questions. I just didn't know they'd already bought the ticket that made my questions too late. Eppley Airfield in Omaha is an hour up the interstate from Lincoln, and we made it in good time on a Tuesday morning. Grandma sat between me and the window of the rental car, holding my hand the whole way. Her fingers were cool and smelled of the lavender hand cream she'd used my entire life. At the airport, she got nervous the way she did in crowds. So I kept her close while my parents handled the bags. We ended up in one of the lounges near the gates, the kind with low chairs, a coffee machine, and too much glass. My father settled Grandma into a chair by the window. He crouched in front of her, took both her hands, and used his warmest voice, the one he saved for clients. "Just sit here," he said. "We'll check in and come right back. We'll check in and come right back." She nodded like a child being good. I almost let it go. But the bad feeling under my ribs stood up and spoke. So I told my parents I'd be right back and stepped 20 feet away to make a call. On my way, I noticed my father stop at the gate desk and lean in to say a few quiet words to the young agent behind it. I figured he was checking on our seats. I phoned the memory care community on the brochure, the one in Arizona, to confirm the arrangements I'd never been shown. A pleasant woman put me on a brief hold. Then she came back and said the words that rearranged my life. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We have no admission under that name. We have no record of any Granger at all." I turned around mid-sentence. The chairs where my parents had been sitting were empty. Their carry-ons were gone. My grandmother sat alone by the window exactly where she'd been told to, her purse in her lap and a folded boarding pass in her hand, waiting for two people who had already walked through security and out of her life. "Just sit here. We'll come right back." They never intended to come back at all. "I want to tell you," I screamed. I didn't. Something in me went very quiet and very fast at the same time, the way it does in a code when there's no room left for feeling and only room for doing. I crossed the lounge, but the chair by the window was empty now too. For one terrible second, I thought they'd taken her after all, or that she'd wandered. Then I heard it. Under the gate announcements and the rolling luggage. Humming. Low and tuneless and absolutely hers. My grandmother hummed when she was frightened. The same old hymn her whole life. The one my late grandfather used to sing to her in the garden. I followed the sound around a bank of chairs and found her standing near the window, showing a folded photograph to a young woman in an airline uniform. "And this is my Walter," Grandma was telling her, pointing at a man 6 years dead. "He sings to me." The gate agent looked up at me with the kind, helpless face people get around dementia. I told her I was family. That I was a nurse. That I had her. And then my grandmother turned. For a moment, the fog lifted the way it sometimes did, sudden and bright and cruelly brief. She looked at me. Really looked. And her whole face softened. "There you are," she said. "I knew you'd come back. I have caught newborns and pressed on stopped hearts and signed the bottoms of death certificates with steady hands. My hands were not steady then." I knelt down in front of her, took the boarding pass from her fingers, and folded it once more into a small, hard square before putting it in my pocket. A one-way ticket. To a city she had no reason to fly to. Bought for a woman who would be found alone and become someone else's problem. They thought she wouldn't understand what had happened to her. The trouble was, I understood it perfectly. There's a version of this story where I fall apart in that lounge, and I'd understand it. But I had a confused, dehydrated 82-year-old in front of me, and panic doesn't help a patient. So I worked. I got her sitting again. Got water into her in small sips. Checked her color. Checked her pulse at the wrist out of habit. She was tired and rattled, but physically all right. Then I did the thing that nursing beats into you over 1,000 bad nights. I started writing down the time. I opened the Notes app on my phone and logged everything. The hour we arrived. The time my father said, "We'll come right back." The time the facility told me there was no admission. The time I found her alone. I photographed the empty chairs. I photographed the boarding pass front and back before it went into my pocket. I called my father. It rang twice and went to voicemail, which means he saw my name and pressed the side button. I called my mother. A text came back within a minute, and I've kept it. "Don't make this dramatic. We've earned a rest. She's in good hands with you." Earned a rest. Good hands. As if abandoning a woman with Alzheimer's in an airport were a spa day they'd budgeted for. I sat with my grandmother's head against my shoulder while she hummed herself calm, and I felt something settle in me that has never fully left. Not rage. Rage is loud and useless. This was quieter. and far more dangerous to them. It was the cold, clear focus of someone who knows exactly how systems work and has just decided to use every one of them. They'd left a paper trail without meaning to. And I am very, very good with paper. The first practical problem was where to take her. I couldn't bring her back to my parents' house in Lincoln. They weren't there. They'd boarded their own flight to Phoenix to go look at the retirement condo, the one this whole family trip had really been about. I learned that later. But I suspected it in the parking garage. So I drove us the hour back down to Lincoln to my little rental and got her settled on my couch with a blanket and the TV turned low. She slept 12 hours. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew my apartment wouldn't hold. It was small. It had stairs. And worst of all, it was strange to her. And strangeness is the enemy in dementia. There was only one place on earth my grandmother's brain still trusted. The farm. I wasn't naive about how it might look. I'm a nurse, and I knew that moving a woman who couldn't consent carried its own risks, and that my father would find a way to call it kidnapping. But you do not hand a vulnerable patient back to the people who abandoned her 12 hours earlier. Not when her safety is the whole question. And I decided I'd get a lawyer on the phone before I did one more thing I couldn't defend. So once she'd eaten, I packed a bag, buckled her in, and pointed the car west. 2 hours on I-80, with the flat gold fields rolling by. The Kearney exit coming up like an old promise. The farmhouse key was where it had always been, under the loose brick by the propane tank. And it still turned the lock. Inside, the air smelled like dust and dried lavender, and the particular mustiness of a house missing its person. Grandma walked in, set her purse on the same hook she'd used for 50 years, and her shoulders came down 2 inches. "I'll start the coffee," she said, clear as a bell, and went to a kitchen she suddenly remembered. I stood in the doorway and watched her hands find the percolator without her eyes. The disease takes so much. But the body holds the places we loved the longest. I didn't know yet what I'd have to fight to keep her here. I just knew I wasn't taking her anywhere else. The farm told on them before the family did. I spent that first day opening windows and wiping a year of grime off the counters, half listening as Grandma drifted between the present and 1974. She told me about Walter, about the garden, about the lavender rose she'd planted for the bees and for the smell of a thing that doesn't quit. Not one word about lawyers or money. Whatever my parents were after, she wasn't guarding it. She'd long since let it go where the rest of her recent life had gone. Then I cleared the stack of mail and circulars off the kitchen table. And underneath it, I found something that stopped my hands. A glossy folder from a realty company in Kearney. Prairie Line Realty. Inside was a comparative market analysis on the farm. The full 160 acres. Complete with an estimated sale price that had a comma in a place that made my stomach turn. Clipped to it was a draft listing agreement. Half filled out and unsigned. Dated 3 weeks earlier. With my father's name typed in the seller line. He'd gotten the agent that far, I would learn later, by telling her he was about to be appointed to handle his mother's affairs. Which was simply a lie. 3 weeks before the trip. Before the lounge. My parents had walked a stranger across my grandmother's land, taken photographs of her home, and priced it for sale. And they had never once asked the woman who owned it. They hadn't asked her because they couldn't. She couldn't understand the question anymore. Which raised the only question that mattered to me, standing there in her kitchen with her humming in the next room. If my grandmother couldn't consent to sell her own farm, then by what authority did my father think he could sell it for her? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew exactly who to call to find out. My parents were back from Arizona within 3 days. And the phone calls started immediately. My mother went first. All warmth and reason. "Sweetheart, this has gone far enough. Bring her back to Lincoln. You're not equipped to do this alone." I almost laughed. "I do this for a living." My father took a harder line. "You don't get to just take her, Dana. There are decisions being made for her welfare, and you're interfering." Decisions made for her welfare by the people who'd left her in a lounge. But it was my Uncle Wes who told the truth. Because Wes has never been able to hold a thought in without it spilling out the bottom. Wes ran an auto shop down in Grand Island. And Wes had money problems the family pretended not to see. He called me himself, skipping the pleasantries. Look, the farm has to sell this quarter. It just does. So whatever you think you're doing, you're costing all of us. There it was. Not her welfare. The quarter. I asked Wes as evenly as I could how exactly they planned to sell a farm that belonged to a living woman who hadn't agreed to anything. He went quiet. Then he said something that turned the low feeling under my ribs into a plan. Your dad's handling that. There's a process. We just need her looked at by a doctor. Declared, you know. Then it's clean. Declared. They wanted her declared incompetent. Not to protect her, but to take the wheel of her estate and drive it straight to a closing table. My mother let the same word slip on the next call, dressed up a little nicer. A competency evaluation. It's just paperwork, Dana. It is never just paperwork. And I was about to make sure they learned that the expensive way. I didn't argue with them anymore after that. Arguing is what they wanted, because an argument is just noise, and noise goes nowhere. Instead, I called a lawyer. Not a flashy one. An elder law attorney in Kearney named Gene Howerin, a man in his late 60s who had been practicing in Buffalo County since before I was born and who answered his own phone. I told him everything in order, the way I'd been trained to give report at a shift change. The trip, the lounge, the phone call to the facility that didn't exist, the boarding pass, the listing agreement dated 3 weeks before the flight, the competency evaluation they wanted. He let me finish without interrupting, which is its own kind of mercy. Then he said something that told me I'd called the right man. You did 3 things right in the first hour that most families never think to do. You wrote down the times. You took photographs. And you kept her with you instead of handing her back. He paused. And no, taking her somewhere safe wasn't kidnapping, no matter what your father says. When the people responsible for a vulnerable adult abandon her, getting her to safety is exactly what the law expects. We'll paper it properly, and we'll do it fast. Then, quieter. Tell me you kept the boarding pass. I told him it was in my wallet, that very minute. I want to pause here because some of you watching know exactly how this feels. You're the one who shows up. You're the one everyone calls when it's hard and somehow never when it's easy. You've been told you're good at this, which is how families turn a person into a service. If that's you, stay with me, because this is the part where she stops being the only one who shows up and starts being the one who's ready. Subscribe so the next quiet woman carrying her whole family can find this story when she needs it. Now, back to Mr. Howerin and what he told me about the law. Before I tell you the law, I have to tell you what it cost, because nothing about this was clean or easy. My parents got to the family first. They were always better at the story than at the truth. By the end of that week, half the relatives believed I had taken Grandma in some fit of drama, that I'd cut her off from her loving son and daughter-in-law, that I was unstable, overworked, maybe a little unwell. My father is very good at looking concerned. My mother cries on cue. Against 2 people who look that good in church clothes, a tired nurse who works nights doesn't stand a chance in the rumor mill. My phone filled with messages from aunts and cousins, some confused, some cold. One great-aunt called to tell me, in a voice dripping with worry, that my mother was just sick about the money you're spending of Edith's. That one landed, I'll admit, because here's my particular weakness, the one I've had to learn the hard way. I am the woman who does everything alone. I don't ask for help. I don't build a team. I carry it and tell myself that needing no one is the same as being strong. So when the family closed ranks against me, my first instinct wasn't to call allies. I didn't have any. I'd spent my whole life being the one others leaned on, and I'd never once practiced leaning back. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen that night, feeling more outnumbered than I'd ever felt in my life, with one confused old woman asleep down the hall and a folder full of paper that I wasn't yet sure was enough. And then I remembered the one thing they kept saying. They kept saying she wouldn't know. And I started to understand that they had no idea what she knew. I went back through every message and call from the weeks before the trip, reading them the way you read a chart on a patient who crashed, looking for the moment it all went wrong. And there it was, in a voicemail my mother had left me the night before we drove to Omaha, one I'd only half listened to at the time. She'd been talking fast, the way she does when she's convinced herself of something. Honestly, Dana, the doctors say she's barely there. She won't even know we're gone. She won't even know we're gone. I sat with that for a long time. There was a text thread too, that I shouldn't have been able to see, but could because my father had once added me to a family group and never removed me. He'd written it to Wes weeks earlier, casual as anything. Don't worry about Mom. The farm's basically mine anyway. Just need to move her along. The farm's basically mine anyway. Just need to move her along. Move her along. Like cattle. Like inventory. Like a chair you carry to the curb. And underneath the disgust, something useful clarified for me. This wasn't a family that had cracked under the unbearable weight of caregiving, though they'd certainly tell the judge it was. This was a calculation. They had decided in advance and in writing that an old woman's mind was gone, that her land was theirs, and that the most efficient way to collect was to lose her somewhere far away and let the state sort it out. They had done the math on her. What they'd forgotten is that I do math, too. And the most expensive miscalculation they made wasn't the listing agreement or the one-way ticket. It was the assumption hiding under every cruel word. They thought she wouldn't know. She knew. She knew exactly who walked away and exactly who came back. I won't pretend caring for her was easy, because that would dishonor everyone watching this who actually does it. The nights were the worst. Dementia gets louder when the sun goes down. They call it sundowning. And there's no chart that prepares you for the woman who raised you not knowing your face at 2 o'clock in the morning. She'd get up frightened, looking for Walter, looking for a baby long grown. The thing that worked, the only thing, was her own garden. I'd take her hands and rub the lavender cream into them, the same scent from the same brand she'd used for 40 years, and I'd walk her to the back window where her lavender rose used to be. They'd gone to seed and weeds in the years she was away, grey and leggy and half dead in the dark. But she'd look at them, and something in her would quiet. Every time, as if for the first time, she'd tell me, lavender is the one plant that smells better after you cut it back. I started to think she was telling me something more than gardening. In the middle of one of those nights, headlights swung across the kitchen. My Uncle Wes. Unannounced. 11 o'clock. Just wanting to talk. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to walk through the house. I watched him drift toward the old roll-top desk, opening drawers, lifting papers, his eyes hunting. Finally, he turned to me and asked the question that told me how blind they were flying. Where does she keep the deed, Dana? We can't find the deed to the farm anywhere. I almost smiled. They'd planned to sell 160 acres, and they didn't even have the paper that said it was theirs to sell. Because it wasn't. And they were about to find out exactly how it wasn't. The thing that changed everything wasn't a letter or a secret will. It was 30 seconds of grainy footage. Mr. Howaren had told me to report the abandonment to Adult Protective Services. And I had. The very next day. The caseworker assigned to it was a woman named Marian Doyle. Marian had spent 30 years watching families do terrible things to their elders, and nothing in my story surprised her. Which was somehow the most chilling part. She moved faster than I expected. She requested the airport security footage before it could cycle off the system. A week later, she called and asked me to come watch it with her. I want to be honest about what I expected. I expected confusion. A crowded lounge. A misunderstanding. Maybe even an accident I could have forgiven. That is not what the camera showed. The camera showed my father crouching in front of my grandmother and taking her hands exactly as I remembered. It showed him stand, say something, and pat her shoulder. Then it showed him turn and walk away. And here is the detail I will carry to my own grave. Halfway across that lounge, with his mother sitting alone behind him, My father lifted his wrist and checked his watch. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was on schedule. My mother appeared at the edge of the frame, glanced back once, and the two of them walked together toward security without breaking stride. The way you leave a gate. Not the way you leave your mother. Marian let the clip run to the end, then froze it on the empty chair. I've done this a long time, she said quietly. That's not a family that fell apart. That's a plan. I asked her to print the still of him checking his watch. It wasn't a confused old woman wandering off. It was a man on his way somewhere, glancing at the time, leaving the woman who raised him behind like a layover he didn't intend to make. I drove to Howren's office with the still photo in a folder and asked him to teach me the rules. All of them. So I'd never again be the last to understand my own family's plan. He poured bad coffee and walked me through it slowly. My grandmother, he explained, no longer had the capacity to sign anything. That door was closed. She couldn't grant me power of attorney now any more than she could sell the farm to my father. The only lawful path left ran through the courthouse, and it had two parts. Guardianship, which is authority over the person, where she lives and how she's cared for, and conservatorship, which is authority over the property, the money, and the land. A court appoints both, he said. And the court's only loyalty is to her best interests. People assume the son gets it automatically, he told me. He doesn't. The judge weighs who is suitable, and the court can pass right over a closer relative if that person is unfit or if their interests collide with hers. Then he said the sentence that turned the whole thing around in my chest. A conservator can't simply sell a ward's real estate to pay his own debts. Selling her land takes a separate petition and the judge's approval. No court in this state signs off on selling grandma's farm to bail out her son's auto shop. I sat there and let it sink in. My parents' entire scheme rested on a foundation that didn't exist. They thought losing her would hand them the land. Instead, the act of losing her was the single best piece of evidence I could possibly bring to a judge deciding who was fit to protect her. Their weapon and my weapon were about to turn out to be the same thing. They just didn't know I was the one holding it. That night, I took the boarding pass out of my wallet and really looked at it. The way you look at an X-ray once you know what the shadow means. I'd been carrying it as a wound. Now I started reading it as a record. It was one way. Not round trip. Not part of a family vacation package. Just a single seat going in one direction to a city my grandmother had no reason on earth to fly to alone. And printed along the bottom was the purchase date. It had been bought 11 days before the trip. 11 days before the smiles. Before the family reconciliation. Before my father crouched down and promised he'd come right back. He had already purchased a one-way ticket that would carry his mother somewhere far from home, where a confused woman found alone would be processed by strangers and quietly become a ward of some other county. The trip wasn't reconciliation. The trip was logistics. I called Marian Doyle the next morning and told her about the purchase date. I asked whether the airline kept records of who bought the ticket and when. She said they did, and that with the abandonment report open, those records could be requested through the proper channels alongside the camera footage already in hand. I added it to the folder. The folder was getting thick now, and every page in it was something my parents had created themselves and handed to me without realizing. The listing agreement they'd signed. The voicemail my mother left. The text my father sent. The footage. The ticket. I hadn't dug up a single secret. I had simply refused to throw away anything they gave me. And they were about to give me one more gift. They were about to take me to court. They struck first, the way people do when they think speed looks like confidence. I was served on a Thursday, standing in my grandmother's kitchen with flour on my hands by a process server who looked genuinely sorry about it. My father and my uncle had filed a petition for guardianship and conservatorship of Edith Granger. Their petition named me, of course. According to the paperwork, I was the problem. I had removed the ward from her established residence, isolated her from her immediate family, and was exercising undue influence over a vulnerable adult, likely, it implied, to get my hands on her estate. I had to read it twice because the gall of it took a minute to register. The two people who had bought a one-way ticket and left her in an airport were petitioning a court to protect her from me. The arsonist had called the fire department to report the homeowner. I'll tell you the honest truth about how it felt. For about an hour, it felt like losing. They had money for lawyers and a story polished by years of telling. I had a folder, a night shift nurse's salary, and a grandmother who couldn't testify on her own behalf. But how Aaron, when I called him in something close to panic, sounded almost pleased. "Good," he said. "Let them file." He paused. "Now there's a hearing. Now a judge has to look at all of it." She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking me to agree that what they'd done was reasonable because the cost to her had been high. I set down my cup. "Mom," I said. She knew exactly who walked away, and she knew exactly who came back. "You still don't understand what the problem is, do you?" She left without finishing her tea. I never doubted again. After she left, I made the decision that the whole rest of my life would hang on. I had a choice, and how Aaron laid it out fairly. We could settle. They might, under the weight of the evidence, agree to drop their petition and quietly let me keep Grandma if I agreed to keep the worst of it out of the record. Or we could go to the hearing and put all of it in front of a judge, on the record, in public, with my parents in the room. The quiet way would protect the family name. The loud way would protect every other family that has someone like my grandmother and someone like my father. I thought about Teresa, who remembered an old woman alone. I thought about Marion, who'd watched that footage with 30 years of experience and called it a plan. I thought about the listing agreement dated 3 weeks before the Smiles. And I decided that the family name had been protecting the wrong people for far too long. I'd take her home to that farm legally and for good. And I'd do it in the daylight where everyone could see. The hearing got moved up after that because of the open abandonment report. The court wanted answers fast. So did I. The closer we got to the date, the more desperate they grew, and desperation makes people careless. Uncle Wes was the crack in the dam. His auto shop in Grand Island was further gone than the family had let on. The bank had called his note, and his entire plan for staying afloat had been his share of the farm sale, money he'd been counting as good as banked for months. With the sale frozen, Wes was weeks from losing the shop he'd built over 20 years. So Wes leaned on my father hard, and my father, who could not afford his own life either, leaned back. I heard about it secondhand from a cousin who'd finally started to wonder why the loving son was so frantic to sell his confused mother's land. Their lawyer kept building the story that I was the schemer, the lonely niece who'd locked Grandma away on a farm to seize her estate. He repeated it so often I think he came to believe it. What their lawyer didn't know, because his clients hadn't told him, was that there was no estate to seize. No deed in their favor. No secret document I was hiding. There was only an old woman who owned her own land, a court that would decide who could be trusted with her, and 30 seconds of footage of my father checking his watch as he walked away. They were arguing about the contents of a safe that didn't exist while I held the only thing that was actually real. I almost felt sorry for the lawyer. He'd been hired to defend a story, and his own clients had handed me the facts. Some fights you win in the room. This one I'd already won. I just had to walk in and let everyone see it. The night before the hearing, my grandmother had one of her hard nights. As if she could feel the air tightening, even though no one had told her a thing. She woke a little after midnight, frightened, asking for Walter, asking why the house was so dark. I did what I always did. I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hands in mine. I worked the lavender cream into them, the same scent she'd once rubbed into mine after a day of weeding. The world had turned all the way around now so that the child was the one steadying the grandmother. Somewhere in that year, I had stopped being the girl she comforted and become the woman who comforted her. Neither of us had marked the day it changed. She calmed under my hands. Then she started to hum that old hymn, Low and Certain, the one Walter used to sing in the garden. Without quite deciding to, I hummed it with her. The two of us sat in the dark in a farmhouse her family was trying to sell out from under her. At the end of it, She looked at me with a flash of that terrible, beautiful clarity and asked a question I'll hear for the rest of my life. Are they coming back? I knew exactly who she meant, even if she didn't. I held her hands a little tighter and told her the truth, the only promise I've ever been completely sure I could keep. No, I said. But I am. Every time. She nodded like that was enough and fell asleep. I sat there until the window went gray, knowing that in a few hours I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. The paper would do it for me. The Buffalo County Courthouse was a solid old building with marble floors that carried sound. On the morning of the hearing, the hallway outside the courtroom was full of my family. My parents had dressed for it. My father wore the gray suit he saved for funerals and big sales. My mother wore pearls and the carefully composed face of a woman who had been wronged. Uncle Wes paced near the water fountain, unable to stand still, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Their lawyer worked the group in low, confident tones. And there, against the far wall on a wooden bench, sat my grandmother in the blue dress she liked, with Marian Doyle on one side and Mr. Howerin on the other. I'd worried all night about bringing her, whether the chaos would frighten her. I shouldn't have. While my father straightened his tie, my mother rehearsed her sad face, and my uncle wore a groove in the marble floor. My grandmother sat perfectly still in the middle of all of it, hands folded in her lap, humming that same old hymn. Soft and steady. The contrast wasn't lost on a single person standing there. The people who claimed to be falling apart from worry over her couldn't stand still. The woman they'd abandoned was the calmest soul in the building. My father wouldn't look at her. My mother couldn't stop looking at her. When the bailiff opened the doors and called the matter of the guardianship and conservatorship of Edith Granger, I took my grandmother's humming hand, helped her to her feet, and walked her in myself. Whatever happened in that room, she would not sit alone in it. Not ever again. They went first, and they went hard. Their lawyer was good. I'll give him that. He stood and painted a portrait of a devoted son and his loyal wife, a couple who had sacrificed their own retirement to care for an ailing mother in their home for a full year, only to have a resentful, isolated niece swoop in, snatch the vulnerable woman away to a remote farm, cut off a loving family, and position herself to control an estate. He used words like unstable, undue influence, and deeply concerning. He noted that I worked nights, lived alone, and had no children of my own to occupy me, as if my entire life were evidence of a deficiency. My father took the stand and was magnificent at it. He let his voice crack at exactly the right moment. He talked about how hard the year had been, how worried he was for Mom's safety out on that farm with just Dana, how he only wanted what was best for her. He never once mentioned an airport. My mother dabbed her eyes. Wes nodded along too vigorously. I sat at our table with my grandmother's hand in mine, her thumb moving in slow circles against my palm, and I could feel the courtroom tilting their way. This is the part where the version of me from a year earlier would have stood up and started yelling the truth. Hot. Desperate. Lost. But I'd learned something in that airport lounge and every night since. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one telling the truth. So when Judge Peterson finally turned to me and asked whether I wished to respond to the petition, I didn't raise my voice. I stood quietly. And I opened the binder. She was asking me to agree that what they'd done was reasonable because the cost to her had been high. I set down my cup. Mom, I said. She knew exactly who walked away, and she knew exactly who came back. You still don't understand what the problem is, do you? She left without finishing her tea. I never doubted again. After she left, I made the decision that the whole rest of my life would hang on. I had a choice, and how Erin laid it out fairly. We could settle. They might, under the weight of the evidence, agree to drop their petition and quietly let me keep her if I agreed to keep the worst of it out of the record. Or we could go to the hearing and put all of it in front of a judge, on the record, in public, with my parents in the room. The quiet way would protect the family name. The loud way would protect every other family that has someone like my grandmother and someone like my father. I thought about Teresa, who remembered an old woman alone. I thought about Marian, who'd watched that footage with 30 years of experience and called it a plan. I thought about the listing agreement dated 3 weeks before the smiles. And I decided that the family name had been protecting the wrong people for far too long. I'd take her home to this farm legally and for good. And I'd do it in the daylight where everyone could see. I want to say something to you directly, because I know who's watching. Somewhere out there is a woman about to step away from her own relative to make one quick phone call, trusting the people standing closest to her. If that's you, read the paperwork before the plane boards. Check the dates. Keep the receipts. The hearing got moved up after that because of the open abandonment report. The court wanted answers fast. So did I. The closer we got to the date, the more desperate they grew, and desperation makes people careless. Uncle Wes was the crack in the dam. His auto shop in Grand Island was further gone than the family had let on. The bank had called his note, and his entire plan for staying afloat had been his share of the farm sale, money he'd been counting as good as banked for months. With the sale frozen, Wes was weeks from losing the shop he'd built over 20 years. So Wes leaned on my father hard, and my father, who could not afford his own life either, leaned back. I heard about it secondhand from a cousin who'd finally started to wonder why the loving son was so frantic to sell his confused mother's land. Their lawyer kept building the story that I was the schemer, the lonely niece who'd locked grandma away on a farm to seize her estate. He repeated it so often I think he came to believe it. What their lawyer didn't know, because his clients hadn't told him, was that there was no estate to seize, no deed in their favor, and no secret document I was hiding. There was only an old woman who owned her own land, a court that would decide who could be trusted with her, and 30 seconds of footage of my father checking his watch as he walked away. They were arguing about the contents of a safe that didn't exist while I held the only thing that was actually real. I almost felt sorry for the lawyer. He'd been hired to defend a story, and his own clients had handed me the facts. Some fights you win in the room. This one I'd already won. I just had to walk in and let everyone see it. The night before the hearing, my grandmother had one of her hard nights, as if she could feel the air tightening even though no one had told her a thing. She woke a little after midnight, frightened, asking for Walter, asking why the house was so dark. I did what I always did. I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hands in mine, working the lavender cream into them, the same scent she'd once rubbed into mine after a day of weeding. The world had turned all the way around now, so that the child was the one comforting the grandmother. Somewhere in that year, I had stopped being the girl she comforted and become the woman who comforted her. Neither of us had marked the day it changed. She calmed under my hands. Then she started to hum that old hymn, low and certain, the one Walter used to sing in the garden. Without quite deciding to, I hummed it with her. The two of us sat in the dark in a farmhouse her family was trying to sell out from under her. At the end of it, she looked at me with a flash of that terrible, beautiful clarity and asked me a question I'll hear for the rest of my life. Are they coming back? I knew exactly who she meant, even if she didn't. I held her hands a little tighter and told her the truth, the only promise I've ever been completely sure I could keep. No, I said. But I am. Every time. She nodded like that was enough and drifted back to sleep. I sat there until the window went gray, knowing that in a few hours I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. The paper would do it for me. The Buffalo County Courthouse is a solid old building with marble floors that carry sound. On the morning of the hearing, the hallway outside the courtroom was full of my family. My parents had dressed for it. My father wore the gray suit he saved for funerals and big sales, and my mother wore pearls and the carefully composed face of a woman who believed she'd been wronged. Uncle Wes paced near the water fountain, unable to stand still, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Their lawyer worked the group in low, confident tones. And there, against the far wall on a wooden bench, sat my grandmother in the blue dress she liked, with Marian Doyle on one side and Mr. Howerin on the other. I'd worried all night about bringing her, whether the chaos would frighten her. I shouldn't have. While my father straightened his tie, my mother rehearsed her sad face, and my uncle wore a groove in the marble floor. My grandmother sat perfectly still in the middle of all of it, hands folded in her lap, humming that same old hymn. Soft and steady, filling the hallway like it was a garden and not a courthouse. The contrast wasn't lost on a single person standing there. The people who claimed to be falling apart from worry over her couldn't stand still. The woman they'd abandoned was the calmest soul in the building. My father wouldn't look at her. My mother couldn't stop looking at her. And when the bailiff opened the doors and called the matter of the guardianship and conservatorship of Edith Granger, I took my grandmother's humming hand, helped her to her feet, and walked her in myself. Whatever happened in that room, she would not sit alone in it. Not ever again. They went first. And they went hard. I stood back up, and I did not match his volume. I went the other way. Your Honor, I said, I think we've heard the issue clearly. Then I sat back down. For a moment, no one spoke. Not their lawyer. Not my father. Not even Wes. The silence settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Judge Peterson looked from my father to the screen still frozen on the image of him checking his watch. Then she looked at my grandmother. Edith sat quietly in her chair, hands folded in her lap, humming. The same hymn. The judge let the silence stretch. Finally, she removed her glasses and folded them carefully on the bench. In 32 years on this court, she said, I have heard many families disagree about what is best for an elderly parent. Nobody moved. But disagreement is not what happened here. Her gaze landed on my father. This court has reviewed evidence of premeditated abandonment, attempts to dispose of property before legal authority existed, and conduct demonstrating a direct conflict between the proposed guardian's interests and those of the protected person. My father looked suddenly smaller. His lawyer stared at the table. Judge Peterson continued. The question before this court is suitability. She turned toward me. Ms. Granger has demonstrated consistent caregiving, professional competence, detailed record-keeping, cooperation with investigators, and a clear commitment to the welfare of her grandmother. Then she turned back toward my father. Mr. Granger has demonstrated the opposite. The words hung there. Simple. Precise. Final. The petition filed by Raymond Granger and Wesley Granger is denied. I heard my mother suck in a breath. The court appoints Dana Granger as guardian and conservator of Edith Granger, effective immediately. My grandmother kept humming, as if none of it concerned her, as if she had spent the entire morning waiting for everyone else to catch up to something she already knew. Then came the sentence people would talk about for years. Judge Peterson looked directly at my father. Based on the evidence presented, I find Mr. Granger unfit to serve in any fiduciary capacity for his mother. Unfit. The word landed harder than any shout. Harder than any accusation. Harder than anything I could have said myself. Because it came from the one person in the room whose opinion actually mattered. My father's face went white. For the first time in my life, he had no speech ready. No smile. No explanation. No story. The hearing ended shortly after that. People began filing out. My mother remained seated, staring at the table. Wes disappeared so quickly I barely noticed him leave. Marian Doyle squeezed my shoulder on her way past. Good work, she said. Not congratulations. Not celebration. Just good work. The kind you say when something painful was also necessary. Then everyone was gone. Everyone except my grandmother. She was still sitting in her chair. Still humming. I knelt beside her. It's over, I told her. She looked at me. Really looked at me. One of those rare moments when the clouds parted. Are we going home? She asked. Home. Not Lincoln. Not a facility. Not a courtroom. Home. Yes, I said. A smile touched her face. Good. That was all. Good. The farm changed slowly after that. The way healing always does. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just one ordinary day after another. I repaired the back fence. I cleared the weeds from the lavender rows. I painted the porch railing. The court approved funds from Grandma's own accounts for her care and the maintenance of the property, Exactly as the law intended. No emergency sale. No secret closing. No disappearing farm. Just stewardship. The way it should have been from the beginning. My parents appealed. Of course they did. The appeal failed. The evidence was the evidence. A year later, my uncle lost the shop. A year after that, my parents sold their house and moved to a smaller one outside Lincoln. I heard about both through cousins. Nobody called me. That was fine. Some relationships don't end with a fight. They end with a verdict. My grandmother lived on the farm for 3 more years. There were hard days. Many of them. Days when she forgot my name. Days when she asked for Walter 10 times before lunch. Days when she looked at me like a stranger. But there were other days too. Days when she remembered exactly where the lavender shears were kept. Days when she laughed at old stories. Days when she sat on the porch at sunset and hummed while the wind moved through the fields. On one of her last clear afternoons, we were watching the garden. The lavender had come back. Thicker than before. Healthier. Cut back hard. Growing anyway. She reached over and patted my hand. "You came back," she said. Not a question. A statement. I swallowed hard. Yes. She nodded, as though confirming something she'd known all along. Then she looked out over the fields and smiled. That evening she hummed the old hymn until she fell asleep. A few months later, she passed peacefully in her own bed. At home. Not alone. Never alone. Sometimes people ask whether I regret taking the public road instead of the quiet one. Whether exposing my own family was worth it. The answer is simple. A family name is not worth more than a vulnerable person. It never was. The thing my parents never understood is that my grandmother remembered the only part that truly mattered. Not the paperwork. Not the hearings. Not the property. She remembered who walked away. And she remembered who came back. In the end, that turned out to be the entire case. And the entire life. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. Keep the records. Read the paperwork. Trust the feeling that tells you something is wrong. And when someone vulnerable needs a person to come back for them, be that person. I'd had her all along. The farm was different after that. Not transformed overnight. Real life doesn't work that way. The roof still leaked over the mudroom when it rained hard. The north fence still leaned. The lavender rose still needed cutting back after years of neglect. There were bills. There was paperwork. There were doctor's appointments and medications and long nights when Alzheimer's reminded me that every victory comes with a price. But it was ours to manage now. Not theirs to sell. The first morning after the hearing, I woke before dawn and found my grandmother already sitting on the porch. The Nebraska sky was just beginning to lighten. She had a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of coffee cooling in her hands. For a moment she looked exactly like the woman who had raised me. Not 82. Not confused. Just Edith. Watching her land wake up. I sat beside her without speaking. The fields stretched out before us, silver with morning dew. After a while she pointed toward the lavender rose. "They need cutting back," she said. I laughed softly. "They do." She nodded. "Always comes back stronger." There it was again. The lesson she'd been teaching me for months without realizing it. Always comes back stronger. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about the farm as the thing I'd saved. The farm was never the point. The point was the woman sitting beside me. The woman everyone else had reduced to paperwork and property values and evaluations. The woman who still remembered kindness when she forgot names. The woman who knew the difference between being left and being loved. The months that followed settled into a rhythm. Good days. Hard days. Ordinary days. My grandmother would spend an afternoon telling me stories from 1968 as if they happened yesterday. Then she'd ask where Walter was. Then she'd remember he was gone and cry as if she'd learned it for the first time. Grief became something she lived over and over. Each time, I sat with her through it. Each time, we made our way back. People talk about dementia as memory loss. What they don't tell you is that it's also memory repetition. The same heartbreak. The same fear. The same confusion. Again and again. Love becomes choosing to answer the same question with the same patience for the 100th time. One evening nearly a year after the hearing, I was helping her into bed when she caught my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Dana." "Yes, Grandma." She studied my face. Really studied it. The way people do when they're trying to place someone they haven't seen in years. Then she smiled. A slow, certain smile. "You came back for me." The words hit harder than anything Judge Peterson had said. Harder than the hearing. Harder than the verdict. Because this was the person who mattered. I swallowed and nodded. "Of course I did." She squeezed my hand once. Then she let go and drifted off to sleep. I sat there for a long time afterward, thinking about airports. About boarding passes. About all the moments that could have gone differently. A 5-minute phone call. An unanswered question. One less bad feeling. One decision to mind my own business. How easily she could have disappeared into a system that never knew her name. How easily everyone would have called it unfortunate and moved on. The truth is that most people who do terrible things don't think of themselves as villains. My parents didn't. My uncle didn't. They told themselves a story that made them reasonable. That made them victims. That made the math work. The problem with reducing a person to a calculation is that eventually you forget they're a person. My grandmother never forgot. Even when she forgot almost everything else. She remembered who sat beside her. She remembered who held her hand. She remembered who came back. 3 years after the hearing, she passed away peacefully in her own home. Not in a facility. Not in a strange room. Not surrounded by strangers. She died in the farmhouse she loved. With lavender growing outside the window. I was there. Holding her hand. The same way she'd held mine when I was small. The funeral was quiet. Small. Exactly what she would have wanted. My parents attended. We barely spoke. There was nothing left to argue about. The court records still existed. The footage still existed. The truth still existed. And time had done what time always does. It had stripped away every excuse and left only the facts. After everyone left, I stayed behind at the cemetery. The sun was setting over the fields. The wind carried the scent of lavender. I stood there looking at the fresh earth and thought about the airport lounge. About a frightened old woman waiting in a chair. About a promise. Just sit here. We'll come right back. The people who made that promise never kept it. So I did. And in the end, that was enough. If you're listening to this and you're the one who always shows up, the one everyone calls when things get difficult, the one carrying responsibilities nobody notices until you stop carrying them, hear me carefully. Keep the records. Trust your instincts. Ask the extra question. Read the paperwork. And never let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness. Because the strongest person in that courtroom wasn't the lawyer with the expensive suit. It wasn't the son with the rehearsed speech. It wasn't even the judge with the gavel. It was an old woman humming a hymn. And the granddaughter who came back for her. That's the whole story. And it's enough. I brought my grandmother home to the farm for good, which legally she'd never left. But now, no one could come for her again. Spring arrived the way it does out there, all at once. After months of nothing, the first warm Saturday finally came. I took her out to the back garden where her lavender rose had gone gray and wild. I cut them back hard, the way she'd taught me, scared the whole time that I was killing them. She sat in a kitchen chair I'd carried into the yard, watching my hands, and told me again that lavender is the one plant that smells better after you cut it down to almost nothing. I understood her finally. Some things have to be cut back to the bone before they can come back stronger. We replanted what wouldn't recover, and within a few weeks there was green where the gray had been. The bees found us again, and the whole backyard started to smell like my entire childhood. One morning I came out with 2 cups of coffee and found her already there in her chair, face turned up to the sun. When she heard me, she opened her eyes and looked at me with that rare clear gaze the disease still gave back now and then, like a gift it couldn't fully take away. "There you are," she said. "I knew you'd come back." She'd said those same words in an airport lounge on the worst day of my life. This time I sat down in the grass beside her chair, handed her the warm cup, and let myself believe her. I had come back. And I wasn't going anywhere. I left the hospital system that year and used what I knew to build something small in Kearney, in a storefront on a quiet downtown street. I called it the Garden Room. It's a coffee shop, mostly. But really, it's a memory cafe, a place where families with someone like my grandmother can come and sit and be known, and not feel like a burden to anyone. There are pots of lavender in the front window, cut from her garden. The older folks hum along when the radio catches an old hymn. Sometimes someone asks about the photograph behind the counter of a man named Walter singing in a garden. And when they do, I get to say his name out loud. It's not a fortune. It's a life. It's hers, growing in me. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all of this, it's that family isn't the people who promise they'll be right back. It's the people who actually come back. And keep coming back. On the worst nights. Through the hardest seasons. When no one is keeping score and there's nothing left to gain. That's my story. One airport lounge. One promise nobody meant to keep. And one quiet woman who refused to throw away anything they handed her. If this story reminded you to ask your parents where the important papers are, or to check on the relative everyone assumes someone else is visiting, take that as a sign. Do it today. And if you know someone carrying their family alone, share this story so they know they're not the only one. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Calm Drama World. Until next time, take care of each other.